I have done another video where I talk about the 5 secrets that non-dual teachers overlook. But I thought it would be worth it to do a video from a slightly different perspective and talk about 5 lies that non-dual teachers are promoting. Because if you don't understand these lies, you can't really reach a non-dual state of awareness. You might think you're in a non-dual state of awareness, but it's simply what many people call spiritual bypassing. And you look at a lot of people out there that are spiritual, that are seeking for something. They realize they are not there and they are looking. And then you see many people who have been pulled into these lies promoted by the non-dual teachers, and they think they reach some ultimate state of awakening or enlightenment, or they have the highest teaching in this non-dual teaching, and therefore they're not looking anymore. And quite frankly, none are more trapped than people who think they're free. So I think as long as we are on a planet like Earth, we always have to be striving for something that we don't see. We have to realize there might be things we don't see, and we need to look for it. So I'm going to talk about these 5 lies. So the first thing we actually need to do here is we need to deal with what I foresee will be the reaction from some non-dual teachers who will say, well, this guy is clearly dualistic. He's talking about lies. And that's the essence of duality. Lie and truth. But we have to talk. We have to be able to talk somehow. And I am just going to assume that you will agree with me that when people 500 years ago believed the earth was flat, the earth was still round. So there are certain common facts that really can form a basis for evaluating what's real, what's unreal, what's true, what's false. Because if there isn't, then we can't even have a conversation. Right, so therefore, I'm just assuming that there is something we can agree on. There's something that's true, the earth is round, and there's something that's a lie, the earth is flat. And so let's take a look at these lies, because what I'm saying here actually has a bearing on the first lie. Because the first lie I'm going to talk about is this very common lie in the modern non-dual movement, which is, it's based on this idea, which is an ancient statement, that only Brahman is real, the world is an illusion. But I'm not really sure that when that statement was made, which I believe was in the 700s by an Indian wise man called Shankara, I'm not really sure that they understood it back then the way non-dual teachers today are promoting it. Because Shankara did actually say, only Brahman is real, the world is an illusion, the world is Brahman. So he was using it more like a koan to jolt your mind. And I think what has happened in today's world is that we have become affected by the scientific mindset. And I've said this before, that there's actually people who are saying that fundamentalist Christianity is a product of the scientific age and the scientific mindset, where we are talking about things in a very black and white way. So scientific materialism says, scientific materialism is absolutely true, there's nothing beyond the material universe. And they're talking about it in these very sharp terms. And fundamentalist Christianity is based on the same idea. The Bible is the infallible Word of God, therefore we must take it literally, because there couldn't be anything wrong with it. And I think some of these non-dual teachers in today's world, they are caught in this mindset. So they look back at Shankara's statement, only Brahman is real, the world is an illusion, and they take it with the same fundamentalist mindset. This must be an absolute truth. But as I said, when you take the third statement, the world is Brahman, you see that it's not meant to be taken literally. It's not to be taken as black and white. And unfortunately, the conclusion that some of these non-dual teachers in today's world seem to have reached is all differentiation is duality. In other words, differentiation is the same as duality. Only Brahman is real because Brahman is, in the East, widely seen as the undifferentiated. The undifferentiated is real, but as soon as there's differentiation, it's unreal. But if you take the complete statement, the world is Brahman, then the world has come out of Brahman because supposedly there was a time where there was no differentiation. There was only Brahman, the undifferentiated. But then somehow differentiation appeared. And if there was nothing but Brahman, differentiation must have appeared out of Brahman, and Brahman must have created it. There must be some kind of consciousness, some kind of will to create differentiation. Otherwise, how would it appear? How would something come out of nothing unless in what we call nothing there is some mind that can conceive of something and manifest it? So, there must have been some kind of mind in Brahman, and we can debate whether that was undifferentiated or not, but that's really beside the point. There must have been some kind of mind that decided to create the world. And when that mind had created the world, it knew what it had created. It had not created a duality. It had just created differentiated forms. So, you cannot say that a circle and a square, it's complete illusions. It's a dualistic to talk about a circle and a square. No, it's just differentiated forms. And the only reason we are here, the only reason we are conscious is that Brahman differentiated itself as us. Otherwise, we wouldn't even have self-awareness. We wouldn't be sitting here debating this statement of what is real and what is unreal if we didn't have self-awareness, a differentiated self-awareness. And if Brahman didn't create us out of itself, where did we come from? Well, that's what these non-dual teachers often bypass. They just don't even talk about it. Or they present it as some kind of, cosmic accident? It just happened. We came into existence as separate selves. Our existence is a complete illusion. We don't actually exist. And the goal of all existence is to go back into this undifferentiated pure awareness and not exist anymore. Hello? If there is a real Brahman who created me out of itself, why would it do that if the goal is that I just go back into Brahman and cease existing? So, what I have been saying in many of my videos, differentiation is not the same as duality. And I do not believe that that's how the Vedic seers and the wise men of India meant it, at least not all of them. Because if they did mean it that way, I think they must have been either not very wise, or they must have been deliberately trying to deceive us. And I'm not saying there aren't beings, which I've talked about in several videos, who are deliberately trying to deceive us and have put out false ideas. But I'm just not sure that all of the wise men of India fall in that category. So therefore, I think there were some of them that had a deeper meaning with it, and that could see that, as I said, differentiation is not the same as duality. And when we deal with this, when we look this straight in the eye, this lie, that differentiation equals duality, we can see that the consequences of believing this is that basically nothing is real. If only the undifferentiated is real, and anything in this differentiated world is unreal, why don't you just kill yourself? Or why don't you, at the very least, shut up and live happily ever after in your own little ivory tower? I mean, if non-dual teachers really believe what they're saying, that differentiation is the same as duality, why are they teaching? Why are they teaching? Yeah, unless it's to make money or gain followers and have power over people. But you see what I'm saying? If they really believe that everything in this world is an illusion, then they must also believe that everything they say is an illusion. There is no awakening here, then. If everything is an illusion, there is no process of awakening. There's no event of awakening. There's no state of enlightenment. It's all illusion. So then they must believe that what they're saying is a lie. It's an illusion they're teaching. So why are you teaching? And then what's the goal of teaching? Well, I would say it's to awaken people. Yeah, awaken people from what? And if everything is unreal, what can awaken? What in you can awaken if all you are is an illusion? Can an illusion awaken itself from itself? So this leads to the second lie that many non-dual teachers are promoting, which is there is no self. And this is based on the first illusion, because when you are saying only the undifferentiated is real and all differentiation is an illusion, that means that your individual existence as an individual being, that's an illusion. And they explain this by saying you have a separate self. You, all that you are, is a separate self that's differentiated from the undifferentiated. So any kind of differentiation into a self can only be a separate self. That's essentially what they're saying. But again, if we see the first lie, that differentiation does not mean duality, then we can say, yes, we can observe in the world that most people are in a state of mind where they act as if they are separate selves. I mean, the basic illusion in the world is, if I steal from you and don't get caught, I have gained an advantage and it hasn't cost me anything. Of course, if you believe in karma, then you realize you made karma for doing it, but most people don't believe in karma, so you can say, most people believe this, I can harm you without harming myself because we're not connected, we're separate beings. You can see that all over the world. So it's understandable that we can look at this and say, what causes people to act as if they are separate beings? Well, they have a separate sense of self. They're identifying themselves as a separate self. And it's this separate self, which I believe is what the Buddha was trying to say, that causes all suffering. But the Buddha also said we can overcome the separate self. So this is essentially what non-dual teachers are also saying. You can overcome your separate self. But what is the you that can overcome the separate self? Because what the non-dual teachings are saying, or at least hinting, is that if you overcome your separate self, you cease to exist. You go back into infinite awareness, or Brahman. You cease being a differentiated being. And what I'm saying is, this is a lie. It's based on the previous lie, but it is a lie. It actually goes against the experience of many, many mystics throughout the ages. You can overcome the separate self and still exist as an individual being with a real sense of self instead of the false sense of self that is the separate self. So you see what I'm trying to say here. When you believe in the first lie, differentiation equals duality, you have to reason with the mind that any kind of differentiated self is unreal, and therefore it should be overcome. And that means you now put yourself in a logical catch-22, a blind alley. Because you cannot explain this very simple question that I just asked. What is it that can overcome the separate self? Which is what non-dual teachers are saying we can do. That's why we can awaken and become enlightened, right? Supposedly enlightenment is overcoming the separate self. But what's then left? Because there are people who have reached a higher state of consciousness than the average person. Many throughout the ages, right? So what I'm saying is, after 48 years on the spiritual path, thinking about this from many different angles, the only logical explanation I have found, the only intuitively sensible explanation I found is that there's a part of our being that is real. You have a separate self right now that is hiding a real self. And when you overcome the separate self, in various degrees, various stages, the real self will begin to shine through. In other words, the real self is like a sun, but there's a pane of glass that's dirty. That's the separate self. When you wash that pane of glass, the sun will shine through. And you will experience yourself as the real self that you are. You will not stop experiencing. You will not disappear into nothingness. That's what it means to be an awakened or enlightened person. You are not experiencing yourself through that separate self, which is an illusion. You are experiencing who you really are. You could say you're not even experiencing yourself at a distance. You are just experiencing that you are, and you're experiencing yourself as you're expressing yourself. So again, how do you see that this is a lie? Well, for me, it's logical. Can a separate self, which is unreal, can it awaken itself? If we recognize that the separate self is an illusion, how can an illusion overcome an illusion? Therefore, for me, the only way that I can come to see that my separate self is an illusion is because the core of my being is a real self that can come to see, oh, wait a minute, I thought I was this separate self. I identified myself as the separate self, but now I see that's an illusion. But I still exist. And as I also have said in many videos, I understand the experience of no self. I understand why people come up with the idea. But that's because they are interpreting an experience. And it can be a genuine mystical experience that millions of people have had over the ages. And what I'm saying is, we have the outer personality, the outer sense of self. We have, as I talk about, the emotional body, the mental body, the identity body. And there are all these individual separate selves in there, subconscious selves. And for most people, they're completely identified with this structure in these three levels of the mind. But the core of our being is what I call a conscious you, which is pure awareness compared to the outer personality. In other words, it's not the outer personality. But it's the reason why we can make progress, the reason why we can talk about spiritual awakening or a spiritual path is that this conscious you can step outside the outer personality, can experience itself as being outside, and therefore it can look at a specific separate self that's based on an illusion and see that it's an illusion, see that it's unreal, and just let it go, let it die. And then it becomes more free. So when the conscious you steps outside the outer personality and experiences itself, it will experience itself at first as pure awareness. I'm not this outer self, and compared to all of the busy talks and internal dialogue and thoughts and feelings that are going on in the outer personality, it feels like there's no self here, because I don't have a clearly defined identity compared to this outer personality. But when the conscious you becomes more comfortable with that experience, when you have it many more times, you start realizing that even though I feel I have no outer self, I still am not complete in myself. I am connected to something. As I said, when you start looking up instead of looking out or down, you see that you have a spiritual self. And the conscious you is an extension of that spiritual self. And the spiritual self has an individuality. It's clearly a differentiated self, but it's not a separate self. Because it's created out of what I call the one mind or the Christ mind. So it sees itself as part of a larger whole that reaches up through different layers of the spiritual realm all the way to the original creator. Because our self-awareness is out of the creator's being. So this is the first lie, differentiation equals duality. The second lie, because all differentiation is unreal, all sense of self is unreal. But in reality, there is a real self, and what is the purpose of this real self? Well, it is to grow in awareness, and this leads to the third illusion, or the third lie. And it's again this: the world is an illusion, meaning nothing is real. Nothing that's happening in this world is real. It's an illusion. There are even those who say nothing is happening. So let's take that statement first. Nothing is happening. There's some validity to it. Because when you are identified with the outer self, you're interpreting everything as it has a meaning that relates to the outer self. Look at what's going on in the Middle East right now, Israelis and Palestinians. They are so identified with this outer identity. I'm an Arab, I'm a Jew. And they have this long history of this fighting between the two groups. And when they're identified with this, they're only looking at the situation from their perspective. Our group is right, the other group is wrong. And the other group says, our group is right, the other group is wrong. Clearly a dualistic struggle. But, so what I'm saying is, you can step beyond this, you can look at this dualistic struggle. And from a certain perspective, once you step outside the struggle, you can say, what is happening in this dualistic struggle isn't real. And therefore, in a sense, you could say, nothing is happening. Because in the dualistic struggle, people are assigning some kind of meaning to everything that happens. But that meaning is related to them as separate beings. And they are assigning an epic importance to it. It is epically important that our group wins over the other group. Like epically important that Christianity becomes the only true religion, therefore we can kill all the Muslims. So this epic importance, this epic mindset, clearly unreal. But when you are in the mindset, you think everything that's happening has some epic importance. And therefore, when you step outside of that, you can look at this whole epic struggle and you can say, nothing is actually happening. Because the meaning that is assigned to it in the epic struggle is unreal. It's an illusion, yes. But when you step outside the separate self, it doesn't mean that there are no events taking place here. It just means you are looking at them neutrally without interpreting them through this dualistic mindset, this epic mindset. I remember when I was a child, there was this children's song. And it had a line where a child was asking his mother, why is the sun so red? This was talking about the sunset. And then, why is the sun gone? Is the sun now dead, mother? So this is just a silly example of how here you have an interpretation. The sun becomes red, it goes down, it disappears. The sun is dead. That's clearly an illusion, right? But from a scientific mindset, we can just say, well, there is a sun in the sky, that's why we are alive on the planet. And the Earth is rotating around its axis, meaning that when we rotate beyond a certain point, we can no longer see the sun. The sun is still up there, but we can't see it because we are on the other side of the Earth. But the Earth will continue rotating and it'll become morning again and we'll be able to see the sun. That's just a neutral observation of what's happening, right? There are things happening in the world. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here to talk about it. And so what I'm saying is that the world is not an illusion in the sense that there is no world and nothing is happening. The world is an illusion in the sense that when we go into this dualistic epic mindset, we are superimposing a mind-made interpretation on the world. And that interpretation is unreal. Therefore, it is like saying, let's put it this way. You're looking at the world, no glasses. You're looking at the world. And you're just seeing what's happening. No interpretation, you're just observing. Then you put on colored glasses. Let's say they're red. Sky now appears purple. Everything has a red tint. It's not that you are not seeing that it gets light and dark and there are trees and so forth, but you are seeing it with a colored tint, and that colored tint is an illusion. So the world you see through the dualistic mindset is an illusion, but if you step outside of this dualistic mindset, you are seeing a world that is not an illusion. Essentially, you're seeing the same world, it's just not colored by the dualistic mindset. And therefore, instead of interpreting everything relating to you and your worldview, you're just observing. Judge not that ye be not judged, as Jesus said. So based on this, the world that you see through duality, through the dualistic mindset, is a dream, but it's possible to step outside of that mindset because the real you can free itself from all these structures in the subconscious mind, and then the world is not a dream. The world is Brahman. The world is an expression of Brahman, and it has a purpose and a meaning. And this is sort of a run-on lie on the idea that the world is an illusion, because then nothing has meaning. Nothing has meaning in a dualistic sense, but outside duality there is a meaning to the world. That's why it exists. Brahman didn't just one day wake up and say, oh, let's create a world even though it's unreal. The Creator had a purpose for creating the world and creating us. And the purpose is that we start out, as I've explained in many videos, with a point-like sense of self, and we can expand our sense of self all the way up to the Creator consciousness. And that's what we are created to do. Expand our sense of self. And this means what? Well, this means there's a purpose to your existence. Because everything you experience and everything you do here on earth helps your higher self grow. You going into this separate sense of identity, identifying yourself as a separate self, it's an experience. But your higher self is processing that experience and using it to grow. So we can say that the role of the higher self is to expand its sense of self. In order to do this, it has sent the conscious you into this world we're in. And we have experiences in this world, we make decisions in this world, and they all have a purpose in helping the higher self grow. Now I explained this in more detail in my video about how the world was created. How the world was created. So watch that if you want to have more detail on it. But my point here is the conscious you that I'm talking about is an extension of the I Am Presence. Therefore, it's not a separate self. It's not a separate being. And therefore you can say from a certain perspective, even the conscious you isn't real. Because the purpose of the conscious you is actually to go into a certain role in the theater of earth, all the world's a stage, as Shakespeare said, experience itself through that role, and then after some time you've had enough of playing that role, you awaken from it. And when you have done this for a long time here on earth, you can come to a point where you ultimately awaken. You ultimately awaken and see that you're done with playing the roles that can be played on earth. And then the conscious you can ascend, as I call it, and merge back into the higher self. So from that perspective, you can say, yes, the goal of the conscious you, in a sense, is to cease to exist as an extension of the I Am Presence and reunite with the I Am Presence. But that doesn't mean that you cease to exist. Now you just become aware of yourself as the I Am Presence. You become aware you were always the separate, or the spiritual self. You were never really separated from it. So you see what I'm saying? It's like if you don't grasp this, you're thinking, oh, I can only be a separate self and it's unreal, so there's no purpose to life. But there is a purpose. And everything you experience here on earth has that purpose of helping you, the totality that you are, grow. And therefore, every experience you've had on earth can be turned into growth. Or it can be denied and you are denying growth. So what I'm saying is that these non-dual teachers who are talking about this, the world is a dream, they are denying the very purpose of our existence, namely growth in awareness. They are completely denying it because they are thinking the only purpose for our existence here is to awaken from the dream so we realize we don't exist. And there never was any purpose. We never actually existed. The world doesn't exist, and so forth and so on. It's complete self-denial. There's really no other way to put it. You're completely denying the reality, and you are replacing with a mental image, a concept created in your own mind. This is what I talked about in my previous video. I talked about the conceptual mind and how it can use the idea of non-duality to create a concept of what it means to be non-dual. And they have created a concept that says, to me, what it means to be non-dual is you don't exist. There's no differentiation. There's no separate self. There is no self. You don't exist. Okay, so the fourth lie that non-dual teachers promote, which is again a follow-on or a consequence of the previous lies. And the fourth lie is that instant awakening is possible. And some will even say instant awakening is the only thing that can happen. So, in other words, some of them are denying that there's a process, that there's a spiritual path to follow. Now, if you go back to Shankara in the 700s, he would have said that's complete nonsense. There is a path to follow, and it's been proven by generations of seekers. And it's been proven by many people since then. There is a path to follow because, as I have explained it here, the conscious you has been identified with a separate self for a very long time. And if you instantly, let's say the separate self just disappeared, or you awakened from it, you wouldn't know who you are. Because you wouldn't have connected to your higher self yet. And therefore you'd be in this no man's land. You would have no sense of self, really. And you can see there are people who have gone through this, followed these non-dual teachers, and they have gone into this, what I consider a blind alley, where they have no sense of self. And you see that they're either depressed or they have no output, there's no vitality, there's no life energy, or they seem deliriously happy. Because you can, let's put it this way, in duality there's always contrast between two opposites. So if you are suffering a lot because in your own mind you have created these separate selves, and really what causes your suffering, let's just be clear on that. What causes your suffering is that in your mind, in these separate selves, you created a mental image of how the world should work. But you're experiencing that the world isn't conforming to your image. And it's this contrast between what you think should happen and what is happening, that's what causes all suffering. You have a mental image in your mind that you're projecting on the world, but the world stubbornly refuses to conform to it. That's the cause of suffering. So if you have this very strong image, very strong attachment to the image, your mind becomes an unbearable place to be. Your outer self, your separate self becomes an unbearable place to be because it's so intense. So if you then find a non-dual teaching that says, oh, the separate self is unreal, and if you manage, the conscious you manage to step outside the separate self, at least for a time, and experience that, yes, it is unreal, then you can temporarily go into a state where you feel deliriously happy, because the contrast between your previous state of tension to now you don't have the same tension is so big that you feel elated. But what many people have experienced, and you can see it more and more on YouTube, that after a while, the honeymoon is over. And you start realizing, oh, yeah, I might have gone through this shift in consciousness, but I still have certain psychology that I haven't overcome and it's causing me suffering. Even non-dual teachers, some of them are willing to admit this, that just happened to them. And what I'm saying is, this is because the conscious you can step completely outside the outer personality. But stepping outside of it does not mean you're free of it, because, and I've explained this in several videos, so I won't go too much into it here, but the outer personality is made up of all of these subconscious selves, and each self is based on a particular illusion. And often the selves are created in a traumatic situation where we have to find some kind of explanation that allows us to deal with this situation psychologically, survive it basically. And that's why we create the separate self based on a certain illusion of how the world works. Just to mention one example. I see many of these fundamentalist Christians, what they're always talking about is, never lose faith. Even if your plan for what should happen in your life doesn't work out, it's because God has a better plan. So always trust that God is in control of your life, no matter what happens. Well, that's a separate self that created this illusion that, oh, God is in control, so you should just take whatever happens. And never say, oh, this shouldn't have happened. Or what could I do to prevent it from happening? Or is there a better way to deal with it than what I'm able to do right now? All these questions you don't need to ask, because there's a separate self that bypasses the whole thing. And this is what you can create when you can actually have a genuine experience of the conscious you stepping outside the separate self. But when you go back into your normal state of awareness, you're creating a separate self based on duality that explains this. Oh, the separate self is unreal. Nothing is real. It's all a dream. There's no purpose. So what I'm saying is, this structure of the outer personality has been created over many lifetimes. One separate self, one illusion at a time. And part of the purpose for life is actually to do this. And then awaken from it. As I've talked about, the earth can be compared to a reality simulator. There's the immersion phase and there's the awakening phase. In immersion, we react to the world, we think we are a product of the world maybe even, and we create all these separate selves. But when we then look at each self individually, see the illusion and awaken, then we grow. Because the conscious you grows by first identifying itself as a human being that has this kind of personality, these characteristics. You are defined by the outer characteristics, and then you come to see, no, I'm not defined by any of these characteristics. Or rather, you come to see, I'm not defined by that characteristic. And then I'm not defined by that characteristic. And eventually, after a long process that takes several lifetimes, you can come to a point where you realize you're not defined by any characteristics on earth. And that's when you can then ascend and merge back with the I Am Presence, or the spiritual self. So, if you look at this idea, right, where you are denying that there's a path, and or you are saying, you can come to a point where you switch your identity, and suddenly you are awakened. It's actually a very strange idea, because it denies, basically, that there's a higher state of consciousness. I know this is subtle, so just think about it. First of all, there's the idea that when you have an awakening experience, you are completely awakened. And this is what some will claim. And what I'm saying is, if you have all these subconscious selves in your mind, that makes your mind a very, very intense place. And you will see that some of these people who claim to have had an instant awakening, it was when they were really, really depressed, almost suicidal, or they were, very intensely suffering, to the point where they couldn't stand it anymore. then because of the intensity created in our minds, the conscious you steps outside of the outer personality. Now it experiences itself as pure awareness. But your experience doesn't really last. You go back into a normal state of awareness, you have to function in the world, but now you are using the outer mind to interpret what just happened. And if you have this that has been created in a non-dual movement about instant awakening, you are thinking, oh, I was awakened. This means I'm awakened. This means I have no more ego. I'm ego-free. I don't need to look at my psychology anymore because I was totally free of ego out there. And now that I'm back, it means that I see that all of the outer personality is unreal, so I'm free of it. So that's a very strange idea, which of course contradicts most people's experience. And then, but the other thing is that it actually makes people think that once you have had this awakening experience, and as I'm saying, this is just one experience. If you have more and more of these experiences, the conscious you gradually begins to realize that it is an extension of the spiritual self. But if you just have one, you can interpret it as this was the ultimate experience. And what you are then beginning to think is, there is nothing beyond that experience. You have reached the highest experience. You are now awakened or enlightened or whatever you call it. And that means now you're going into a strange state of mind, which is what I see in some of these non-dual teachers. And you can probably see it yourself if you keep this in mind and watch some of these videos. See, when you are actually still seeing yourself as a being who is gradually growing towards a higher state of awareness, you are in a state of mind where you're seeking to explain things. Because you are saying, I don't understand this. What is the higher understanding? Oh, now I have a better explanation. But you can keep doing this. I've been on the spiritual path for 48 years. I don't claim to have the final understanding because I see how many times I have had an understanding. It wasn't that it was wrong or invalid, but it just wasn't the highest perspective. It's like, I've used this metaphor before, you're in a forest, there's an observation tower, right? And you're walking up the stairs in that observation tower. And in the beginning you get off the ground, now you're looking at all the tree trunks. And what you're seeing is not wrong. There are tree trunks. Then you walk higher. Now all you can see are the leaves of the trees. And what you're seeing is not wrong. The leaves are there. But finally you get up to the top of the observation tower and now you're above the treetops and you can see the whole landscape. So it was not wrong that you only could see tree trunks. But it would have been wrong if you believed, oh, there's nothing but tree trunks in the world and I can't go higher. This is the ultimate understanding I have. Because then you wouldn't have gotten to the top where you could see out over the whole landscape. And that's what some of these people do. And then it's one thing to believe this, and it's another thing to set yourself up as a spiritual teacher and say, this is the ultimate experience. I'm now in an ultimate state of consciousness. I'm an awakened person. Because the consequence of this is, there is nothing higher. And as I've explained in several videos, and as I just explained now, the purpose is that the spiritual self starts with a very localized sense of self and gradually expands it all the way to the greater consciousness. And that is a very, very high state of consciousness that absolutely cannot be attained on this planet. It cannot. You cannot attain a greater consciousness on this planet. I don't care what you say about this master or that master was God realized and was enlightened and this and that. You cannot remain in a physical body on earth and attain a greater consciousness. It is so far above you, us, all of us, that it's ridiculous. And it's just the hubris of the ego to think that you could attain an ultimate state of consciousness while still being on this planet. Just look at the planet. It must be a very low planet with all the things that are going on. You think we can attain the ultimate state of awareness here? But when you think you have attained the ultimate state of consciousness, what is the effect? You don't strive higher. Because the only thing that, that you really, when you are in that state of mind that some of these non-dual teachers claim to be in, the only thing you can look forward to is that your body dies and you dissolve into infinite awareness. You exist no more. I don't know if that's something to look forward to. I'm not sure they look forward to it. But that's the consequence of what they're saying, that they've reached an ultimate state of consciousness. Because the only thing above that would be no state of consciousness, no existence. But the effect of that is, of course, also there's two effects of it. First of all, they don't strive to go higher. And as I said, there is definitely something higher, which is you can ascend from Earth, and then when you ascend, you can start working your way up in the spiritual realm, all the layers of the spiritual realm until you reach the greater consciousness. But the other effect of it is that when you think you reached an ultimate state of consciousness, why look at your unresolved psychology? Why look into your subconscious mind? Why seek to overcome these separate selves? And that's actually why you can see some of these people who claim to be enlightened, who are behaving in ways that are obviously the effect of unresolved psychology, which they claim they don't have, because they are ego-free. They have experienced ego death. So you stop your growth if you believe in this lie. Okay, so now I have sort of hinted at the fifth lie that I'm going to talk about. And it follows on all the other ones. Because if you believe that all differentiation is duality, then you are saying the world is dualistic. And therefore you are not open to the very central idea that I'm talking about, I have been talking about in all of my videos. That is, that duality is a state of consciousness, not a state of the world. And when you say there is no real self, you are saying, well, the separate self is dualistic, and therefore you just need to overcome that separate self and see the illusion. You don't need to look into your subconscious mind and your psychology. And when you think the world is an illusion, it's all a dream, well, again, why do you need to look at duality as a state of consciousness? It's all unreal. Everything is unreal. In other words, you don't need to discern between something that's real. As I said, there is a planet that revolves around itself. And so everything is equally valid, invalid. And then you think that you've gone through an instant awakening, so you don't need to look at you don't need to consider a simple question. You think you have awakened, or you think you can awaken. So you don't need to consider a simple question. What am I being awakened from? Why did I go into separation in the first place? And why is it that people want to believe in these four lies that I mentioned so far? It's because, I'm being blunt here, they are not willing to take responsibility for themselves. They think, they basically believe the same as the fundamentalist Christians. Because what do the fundamentalist Christians believe? I don't have to look at my psychology. I don't have to look at the beam in my own eye, even though Jesus told me to. I don't have to change myself. I just have to declare Jesus to be my Lord and Savior, and then I'm guaranteed to enter heaven. And this is what these non-dual teachers are preaching. You just need to shift your mind and have an awakening, and then you have reached the ultimate level. You don't need to look at yourself. You don't need to look at your mind, your subconscious mind, your unresolved psychology, your shadow, as some call it. There are some that, of course, say you have to do shadow work, but there are some that say, no, that's another illusion. You just need to awaken from it all. But even if they talk about shadow work, are they talking about what is this shadow? Where did it come from? And what is it made out of? And what I'm saying is this, and I've said this in a number of my videos. We started out as the conscious you, sent by the I Am Presence to take embodiment on this dense planet called Earth. And we had two options for how we would use that opportunity, which is basically our imagination, our free will, our ability to create concepts in the mind and test them against reality. We have two options. We can see ourselves, and this is how we start out, as connected beings. We don't necessarily know, have a clear image of what we're connected to, the higher self, but we can expand our sense of connection, become more aware of what we're connected to. And that's one way to go. It's not that it's the right or the wrong way, it's just one option we have. The other option we have is that we can go into separation, start seeing ourselves as a separate being, so we lose the connection to our higher self. But how do we go into separation? by using the duality consciousness. Why? Well, I've talked about it in a number of videos, so I'm just going to give a really brief summary here. In duality, you have two opposite extremes. Christianity is the only true religion. Islam is of the devil. Communism is the only true economic system. Capitalism is of the devil. True and false, right and wrong. But everything is duality. Nothing in duality is true in an ultimate sense because it isn't real. It's all created in the mind. It is an illusion. It is a dream. Because this is the feature of the dualistic mind. You can say, when you're a connected being, you are realizing there is a reality outside of my own mind. And I'm seeking to connect to it so I get a higher and higher understanding and awareness of how the real world works. Because you experience there is a real world. When you go into duality, you'll go into a state of mind where you think. You don't have to connect to any reality outside your own mind. Because your mind can define what is real and unreal. And it does this by using this duality consciousness, where it takes two extremes that are relative, capitalism and communism. It elevates one to the status, this is the ultimate truth. And, you know, because duality has the two opposite extremes, you can never feel secure in your truth. It will always be threatened. And this is what creates this, you might even say, a downward spiral, where you're choosing something. I know I'm simplifying it with communism and capitalism or this or that, but I'm just saying you're taking one relative truth and you're elevating it to the status of being absolute, of one relative idea, concept, elevating it to the status of being an absolute truth. But then something in the world threatens your sense of security that this is an absolute truth. And in order to deal with that, you're creating another separate self that denies the threat, explains it away. That's why you can see these people who are absolutely convinced that they are right, that the earth is flat, and all the rest of us have been fooled into believing it's round. And whatever you come up with, they will just find a way to deny it. This is the feature of duality, the dualistic consciousness. And that's why I've been saying over and over again, if you really want to attain a non-dual state of awareness, you have to study the duality consciousness that pulled us out of the connected sense of self and made us think that we can define how the world should work. Because if you don't realize this essential feature of duality, what are you going to do? You're going to hear the idea, oh, there's a non-dual state of awareness. But instead of seeking to experience it and experience it in more and more clear ways and connect to it, you are creating with the dualistic mind a concept of what non-dual awareness is. And then you are projecting that, and then you are striving to achieve that dualistic view of non-duality. And therefore you create this concept, oh, the self is unreal, so I'm striving to attain a non-self. Now I watched a video with a fairly known non-dual teacher who is no longer a non-dual teacher. But he was saying in there, in the video, that yeah, he was talking about the illusions that he had overcome and seen what was not real about non-dual teachings. And he has said, I used to go around saying, I am pure awareness. And I really believed I was pure awareness. But as I'm saying, who is the I that says I am pure awareness? Because in pure awareness there can't be an I. So if you're saying I am pure awareness, you are proving you are not pure awareness, because pure awareness is undifferentiated. And if there's an I, there's differentiation. Now, as I said, nothing wrong with differentiation. But the question is, which I is saying I'm pure awareness? Well, it can't be the conscious you. Well, it can actually, I have to correct myself, it can temporarily. If the conscious you has this experience of going outside the outer personality, it experiences itself as pure awareness. And therefore it can come back and say, I am pure awareness. That's true. But it's more likely that once you come back from the experience, the separate self is going to superimpose a dualistic view on it and say, I am pure awareness, and that's the ultimate state of consciousness. Whereas what I'm saying is, when the conscious you keeps going outside the outer personality and doesn't impose an interpretation on it, but just seeks the experience, you come to a point where you experience, no, you're not pure awareness, you are the spiritual self. You are that individuality up there, which is not created down here in relation to the world. That's who you are. So you're not pure awareness. You are a differentiated self. It's just not a dualistic self. So that's why I'm saying the most insidious of all lies promoted by non-dual teachers is you don't need to look at duality. You don't need to consider it. You don't need to understand what it is. No. Just look away from duality. Ignore duality because it's all a dream. It's all an illusion. Look up towards this non-dual state and strive for that. There's an old saying, if you reach for the stars, at least you won't come up with your hands full of mud. But if you're walking around like this and you trip over a rock and fall down, you could very well end up with your hands full of mud. And so it's just, you know, I guess if I step back from all of this, what I have said in many videos is that everything in this world is determined by free will. And the feature of the duality consciousness is you can prove anything you want to prove and believe, experience that is completely real. And the purpose of Earth, which is an unnatural planet, is we are allowed to create any experience we want for ourselves and have it for as long as we want to have it. So in a sense, I could step back from this and say, well, these people who take these non-dual teachings, they're just using the dualistic mind to create an experience of what they think is non-duality, a non-dual state of mind. And they think they are saved, just like the fundamentalist Christians think they are saved. Are the fundamentalist Christians saved? No. But they are experiencing in their minds that they are going to be saved. And it's the same thing. Every other person on the planet are creating this view in our minds. And so I could say, well, that's fine. I mean, let these people who follow non-dual teachings, if they need to have that experience, who am I to tell them any different? Right? But all I'm trying to say is, for those who are open to it, because I have been open to it, is we have a simple choice to make. When we reach a certain level of awareness, a certain stage of this awakening process, right? We have the potential to step up and realize the mind can create absolutely any experience it wants to have and experience that it's real. But we also have the ability of the conscious you to step outside the outer mind, connect to something that's beyond our own minds, that it is even beyond this world, and that is real. So you could say another lie, now I don't know how many I've talked about so far, but more than 5, is again this, nothing is real. But there is something that's real beyond our own minds. There is something real beyond the unreality that our minds have created, both individually and collectively. And we have the ability, as I said, to step outside the outer mind and connect to something that's real and gradually expand that connection until it becomes more and more clear. And I'm not going to try and tell you that this is what you should do. I'm just trying to tell you this is an option we all have. And I'm not trying to tell you that I have reached some ultimate state of awakening or awareness or enlightenment by doing this, because I still see myself in the process of having a clear and clear experience of what I'm connected to. And all I'm just saying is, you can do the same. What one has done, all can do. So I just wanted to add a short addendum to this video, because I realized that I didn't talk about what actually happens when you switch and you decide that the key to attaining a non-dual state is to look at and consciously dismiss all of these subconscious selves that are based on the duality consciousness. Because when you do that, first of all, you resolve the psychology. So you've done the shadow work. You overcome the shadow. Instead of being pulled out of your normal state of awareness, you can naturally go into that state. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that when you do that, you escape suffering. Because, what did I say earlier, causes suffering? It is. We use the dualistic state of mind to create a mental image of how the world should work, how we think the world works. We are superimposing it upon the world constantly. And we constantly experience that the world stubbornly refuses to conform to our mental image. So we feel threatened, and that's what causes suffering. So you escape that because you overcome the dualistic view of the world, of how the world should be. You're just observing. The world is what it is, and you are adjusting to it. But this then leads to a point where you can be, as it says in the New Testament, you can be in the world and not of the world. Because you're not identified with the world. You know the world doesn't define you. And you have a right to be who you are and express who you are. And that gives you a sense of purpose, that you are here. The world is really a tool for your growth. And that means that now you can actually engage in the world. Because you see some of these people who claim to have awakened or they are enlightened. And it even goes back to the East again, where you have this ancient ideal that the enlightened person basically sits in a cave in the Himalayas, meditates on God, and allows some disciples or villagers to come up and give him whatever food he needs to survive. But he's not engaged in the world, because the world is just an illusion, it's all nonsense and blah, blah, blah. But when you realize the world is actually a tool, and it's actually a pretty ingeniously designed tool for our growth, you can engage in the world. And then another thing that happens, as I've said before, that I haven't really talked about in this video, but the way to get out of the dualistic state of mind is to reach for something outside your own state of mind, and that is what I call the one mind, or the Christ mind, or the Buddha nature. In other words, there is one mind, and I explained before how this was created and why it was created. I explained that in my video about how the world was created. There is one mind, and that is the reaching for that mind, experiencing that mind. That is what gives us the frame of reference, so we can see that our separate selves are based on illusions, dualistic illusions. We can see through all of the dualistic illusions through the one mind. And basically, when I talk about being connected, we are connected to our higher selves, but we also are more and more aware of this one mind is the reality behind all of these man-made illusions. And when we do this, when we connect more to the one mind, we overcome the focus on self. And so all of a sudden, we are not threatened by other people, for one thing, but we also see that all people are really, we are all connected, we are all part of the whole. And therefore, instead of seeking to raise ourselves, even raising ourselves to a higher state of consciousness, we seek to raise the whole. And you see, obviously you can see in the world that there are people who are trying to get, for example, richer and richer, have more and more money, or people want more and more power as separate beings. But you also see some spiritual beings that are focused on raising themselves only just for the sake of reaching a higher state of consciousness, however they see it. And you can overcome that where you're saying, well, I don't need to worry about raising myself. I'm seeking to raise the whole. I'm seeking to share my insights with other people, express who I am, in the hope that it might inspire others. And again, we're back to, as I said, what one has done, all can do.